Hey guys, tonight we step barefoot into the cold, sticky mud of a medieval village, where the air smells like wet straw and wood smoke, and the day begins long before you're ready for it. You're not a knight. You're not royalty. You're not even the quirky village blacksmith with big forearms and a personality. You're a peasant, and honestly, you probably won't survive this. The sky is still that deep, pre-dawn blue when the church bell starts groaning in the distance. It doesn't ring cheerfully, it complains, a slow, iron-throated sound rolling over the fields, telling you it's time. Time to work, time to pray, time to repeat yesterday. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what your local time is right now. I love seeing how far these nighttime journeys travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, or rather, you squint them open because your hut is already filled with thin grey smoke from last night's dying fire. The roof is thatched, bundles of straw tied together and layered thickly. It keeps most of the rain out, which is impressive, considering it's basically a giant haystack sitting on top of your house. But it doesn't keep out drafts, and it definitely doesn't keep out bugs. You're lying on a sack stuffed with straw. The straw shifts and crackles under you, poking through the thin cloth. It smells faintly sour. There are rumors, well, not rumors, more like accepted facts, that sometimes people tuck herbs like lavender into their bedding to mask the smell. Scholars still argue whether that was common practice or more of a romantic idea we like to imagine. Either way, your mattress tonight smells less like lavender and more like damp field. Your entire house is one room. One room. You share it with your spouse, maybe a child or two, and quite possibly a chicken who wandered in and decided this is home now. In colder months, even a pig might sleep inside to keep warm. It sounds cozy in theory. In reality, it smells like livestock and yesterday's stew. The door creaks open and the morning air seeps in. It's cold, always a little too cold. Even in spring, the dampness clings to your bones. You sit up, joints already protesting. You're maybe 30, but your body feels closer to 50. Fun fact, though not exactly fun for you, many medieval peasants didn't live past their mid-30s. Life expectancy was low, partly because infant mortality dragged the average down, but even adults face disease, malnutrition, and back-breaking labor daily. So when you stretch and hear your spine crack like dry twigs, that's not dramatic effect. That's normal. Outside, the village is stirring. You hear a cough from the neighboring hut, a baby crying, a dog barking at absolutely nothing. The ground is mud. Not cute, aesthetic, cottagecore mud. Thick, sticky, swallow-your-shoe mud. There are no paved roads here. Just dirt paths churned up by feet, hooves, and wooden cartwheels. You step outside barefoot because shoes are precious. If you own them, you save them for rougher terrain. The earth is cold and gritty under your feet. Somewhere beyond the huts, a rooster crows like it personally invented the sunrise. Your day hasn't even begun, and you're already tired. The bell rings again. That bell is your clock. Mechanical clocks exist in some places by the late Middle Ages, but not here. Here, time belongs to the church. Morning prayer, work hours, evening prayer. Sleep. The rhythm never changes. You glance toward the fields. They stretch out in long, narrow strips. This is part of the open field system, a mainstream medieval agricultural practice across much of Europe. Instead of one big, fenced farm, land is divided into scattered strips assigned to different families. It means you don't have one neat plot. You have bits and pieces scattered around, like someone dropped farmland and forgot to organize it. And most of it, it's not even fully yours. You owe labor to your lord. We'll get into him soon enough. Don't worry, he's not as charming as he sounds. But for now, just know that several days a week, you work his land instead of your own, for free, because that's the deal. You take a slow breath. The air smells like wet grass and manure. There's a strange calm in it, though. Birds are waking. The horizon is soft pink. For a moment, just a tiny one, you feel something almost peaceful. Then you remember how long the day will be. You fetch water from the village well. It's communal, of course. You're not special enough for private plumbing. The bucket is heavy, the rope rough against your hands. Someone nearby mutters a prayer under their breath. Faith is everywhere here, stitched into every hour. If the crops fail, God wills it. If you get sick, God tests you. If you survive another winter, God blesses you. Scholars still argue whether peasants were deeply pious out of genuine devotion, or whether religion functioned more as a framework that explained a world that felt uncontrollable. For you, it doesn't matter. You pray because everyone prays. You pray because not praying feels dangerous. You splash cold water on your face. It shocks you awake. Your reflection in the bucket is distorted, wavy. You barely recognize yourself. There's porridge waiting inside, thin, oaty, bland. It fills your stomach, technically. Sometimes you add a bit of onion or cabbage if you're lucky. Meat is rare, reserved mostly for feast days or special occasions. You chew slowly, staring at the doorway. The sun creeps higher, and just like that, the workday begins. You grab your simple wooden tools. Maybe a hoe, maybe a sickle. Iron is expensive, so tools are repaired again and again. You head toward the fields with the others, a quiet procession of hunched figures moving through morning mist. No one talks much. There's nothing new to say. Yesterday was this. Tomorrow will be this. As you step into your assigned strip of land, the soil dark and heavy beneath your feet, you feel it settle in your chest, that quiet understanding that this is your life. Not heroic, not legendary, just steady, grinding labor beneath an open sky. The bell fades behind you, the village shrinks in the distance, and the day, long and unforgiving, stretches out ahead. The soil is already damp when you press your heel into it, testing the weight of the day before it truly begins. The sun is climbing now, pale and distant, like it's not entirely committed to this whole warming the earth idea. You stand in your narrow strip of land, one ribbon among dozens, each separated not by fences but by memory and agreement. Everyone simply knows which part is theirs. Well, mostly. The open field system dominates much of medieval Europe. Instead of private farms with tidy borders, land is divided into long strips scattered across large communal fields. It encourages cooperation, or at least forced tolerance. You plow alongside your neighbors, sow beside them, harvest beside them. You see the same faces every day, year after year, until one of you quietly disappears from illness or age. You grip your wooden plow handle. If you're fortunate, you share an ox with another family. Oxen are slow but steady, strong enough to pull the heavy plow through thick soil. Horses exist, of course, and by the high Middle Ages, the horse collar improves farming efficiency. In many regions, scholars still argue whether that innovation truly revolutionized productivity everywhere or only in certain areas. For you, it doesn't matter. Your ox moves at the pace of a thoughtful cloud. You lean your weight forward. The earth resists, and just like that, your shoulders start burning. Several days a week, this isn't even for you. These are domain days, labor owed directly to your lord. You work his land before your own. No paycheck, no applause, just obligation. In return, you're allowed to live here, farm a few strips, and maybe not be thrown off the estate. It's a strange bargain when you think about it. Protection in exchange for labor. Except the protection part feels vague. Protection from what? Bandits? Invading armies? Wolves? Sometimes those still show up anyway. Your lord doesn't stand beside you in the field. He likely resides in a manor house a short distance away. Stone walls, proper glass windows if he's wealthy enough, a fireplace that doesn't smoke up the entire room. You might see him during rent collection or festivals, mounted on a horse, dressed in colours that somehow stay clean. But today, you see his steward. The steward is the practical face of authority. He rides along the edges of the field, making sure everyone is present, everyone is working. His boots are dry. Yours are not. You bend again, pressing the plough deeper. The soil peels back in thick strips. Your palms blister quickly. You don't. Complain. Complaining doesn't change soil. Mainstream fact: medieval peasants typically worked from sunrise to sunset during peak agricultural seasons. There are no weekends. Only the rhythm of planting and harvesting. And harvest season? That's an entirely different level of exhaustion. You pause for a moment, straightening your back. Around you, the village hums quietly. The blacksmith's hammer rings faintly from a distance. Someone laughs, brief, sharp. A child runs along the edge of the field, chasing something imaginary. You remember being that small. Before your body ached constantly, before the weight of yield expectations settled into your bones. The yield matters. Oh, it matters deeply, because from whatever grows here, you owe a portion to the Lord, another portion to the church, and whatever remains feeds your family through winter. If the harvest fails, there is no backup. Grocery store. No delivery app. Just hunger. There's an odd little detail historians sometimes mention. Peasants occasionally buried small charms or tokens in their fields for luck. Bits of cloth, carved symbols, simple crosses. Whether it truly helped the crops grow is debatable. Scholars still argue whether these practices were common superstition or rare exceptions exaggerated in records. But standing here, sweating into the earth, you understand the impulse. When so much is out of your control, even a scrap of hope feels worth burying. The sun climbs higher. Your tunic sticks to your back. Lunch is brief. A small hunk of dark bread, dense and coarse, maybe a bit of cheese, if you're fortunate. You sit on the edge of your strip, staring across the fields. From here, everything looks peaceful. Rolling green, gentle breeze. The kind of view people centuries later will paint on postcards and call idyllic. They won't paint your cracked hands. They won't paint the constant uncertainty. You chew slowly. A neighbour mutters something about last year's frost. Late frost killed half the barley. You nod. Everyone remembers. Memories of bad harvests linger like ghosts. They shape how carefully you sow, how anxiously you watch the sky. Weather is your silent ruler. Too much rain, crops rot. Too little? They wither. Hail? Devastation. You look upward instinctively, scanning for signs. The sky offers nothing but wide indifference. By afternoon, your arms feel like lead. You switch tasks, repairing a fence post, clearing stones, scattering seed. Every motion is repetitive, every step measured. There's no dramatic moment, no triumphant swell of music, just slow, steady labor. The steward circles again. You lower your gaze slightly, not in shame, but in acknowledgement. Authority flows. Downward here, and you're near the bottom. Below you, possibly the landless laborers. Maybe even serfs more tightly bound than you. There's a subtle difference between free peasants and serfs. Some peasants technically have more mobility. Serfs are legally tied to the land. In practice, though, the freedom feels theoretical. You can't simply pack up and leave. Travel requires permission. Marriage might require approval. Even using the Lord's mill to grind your grain costs a fee. Yes, even grinding your own wheat comes with a charge. It's almost impressive how many ways obligation can be sliced. Late afternoon drifts in. The shadows grow long. Your movements slow slightly, not out of laziness, but because your muscles are nearing their limit. You wipe sweat from your brow with the back of your arm, leaving a streak of dirt. The bell rings again in the distance. Not a harsh sound this time. Softer, calling you back. You guide the ox toward the village. The animal exhales heavily, as if it too is done with this arrangement. You return tools carefully. Tools are precious. Broken tools mean delays. Delays mean lower yield. Lower yield means problems. As you walk home, the mud sucks gently at your feet. Smoke rises from cottages ahead. The scent of boiling cabbage drifts through the air. You feel something complicated settle inside you. Not joy, not despair. Just endurance. This is one day, and tomorrow will look almost exactly the same. You reach your hut as the sun dips low, painting the sky in orange streaks that almost feel too beautiful for this life. You pause for a second, watching it, even here, even. Now, there are moments that surprise you. Then your stomach growls, and reality gently nudges you forward. Your stomach growls again before you even duck inside the hut. It's not dramatic, not loud enough to echo. Just a low, steady reminder that hunger is never fully gone. It only naps. Inside, the air is thicker now, heavy with steam from boiling grain. The pot hangs over the fire, bubbling slowly. Whatever's inside is technically dinner. Technically. You sit down on the rough wooden stool, rubbing your wrists absent-mindedly. Your spouse stirs the pot with a long spoon, scraping the bottom so it doesn't stick. There's no fancy seasoning here. Salt is precious. Pepper is something merchants whisper about in distant cities. Tonight, it's pottage again. Pottage is the medieval peasant's greatest culinary achievement and biggest disappointment. It's a stew, but calling it stew might be generous. It's usually a mix of grains, oats or barley, boiled with whatever vegetables are available. Cabbage, leeks, onions, maybe a few peas if the season is kind. Sometimes the same pot is kept going for days, with new ingredients added as old ones soften into anonymity. Mainstream fact, for most peasants, meat is rare. You might eat pork or chicken during special feast days, perhaps after slaughtering an animal in late autumn to preserve it for winter. But daily meals, mostly grains and vegetables, bread is dark, dense, and sometimes gritty from poorly milled flour. You take the wooden bowl when it's handed to you. It's warm, comforting. In that very small way warmth can be. You blow on it gently and take a careful sip. It tastes fine. That's the best you can say. It fills your stomach, and in this world, that counts as success. There's an odd detail historians sometimes mention. Peasants occasionally flavoured food with wild herbs gathered from hedgerows. Sorrel, nettles, mustard greens. Not because they were gourmet adventurers, but because variety is survival. Scholars still argue whether medieval peasant diets were as monotonous as older records suggest, or if there was more seasonal diversity than we often assume. From where you sit, staring into your bowl, it feels repetitive enough. Your child, if you have one, eats quietly beside you, spoon clumsy in small hands. You watch carefully. Food cannot be wasted. Even crumbs are valuable. Even crusts matter, and yet no matter how carefully you ration, there's always that whisper at the edge of your mind. What if the harvest fails? It's not paranoia, it's memory. You remember last winter? The stores ran thin by late February. The grain sacks felt lighter each week. You stretched meals thinner, added more water, less grain. Hunger sharpened tempers, made nights longer. There's a particular ache to medieval hunger. It's not immediate starvation most of the time. It's chronic, lingering, a constant negotiation between enough and barely. You finish your bowl slowly, scraping the bottom with the spoon. The fire crackles softly. Smoke curls upward, escaping imperfectly through the thatch and any small opening it can find. Your eyes sting a little, but you're used to that. Outside, the sky darkens fully. You step out for a moment, letting cooler air touch your face. The village is quieter now. A dog barks in the distance. Someone coughs, deep and rough. You notice how thin your neighbors look, shoulders sharp beneath rough wool tunics. Malnutrition doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like quiet fatigue. You lean against the hut wall and glance toward the Lord's manor. A faint glow flickers in its windows. They eat better there. That's not envy speaking, that's fact. Lords consume more meat, better bread, and imported spices if they can afford them. Their plates are fuller, their winters warmer, but here's the twist, you still depend on them. The feudal system is a ladder, and you're standing firmly on one of the lower rungs. You provide labor and produce. The Lord offers land access and, theoretically, protection. The church offers spiritual security. Everyone owes someone. You rub your hands together for warmth. Winter is always the quiet threat looming ahead. Harvest. Time is anxiety in motion. Winter is anxiety in stillness. There's something almost philosophical about your hunger. It teaches patience, forces discipline, it shapes every decision. You don't overeat because there is no over. You don't indulge because indulgence is rare. And yet, during feast days, everything changes. You remember the last major festival. The church bells rang louder than usual. Tables were set up outside. There was actual roasted meat. Ale flowed more freely. For a single day, hunger loosened its grip. You laughed, sang, maybe even danced a little. It almost felt dangerous. How joyful it was. Scholars still argue whether these feast days acted as pressure valves for peasant frustrations or genuine communal celebrations rooted in deep faith. For you, it felt like breathing after holding your breath for months. But tonight isn't a feast day. Tonight is ordinary. You step back inside as darkness fully claims the village. There are no streetlights, no glowing windows lining neat roads, just scattered points of firelight and a sky thick with stars. You glance upward once more before closing the door. The stars are brilliant out here, untouched by smoke from factories or city glow. You can see constellations clearly, patterns passed down through generations, stories attached to them. You don't fully understand the astronomy, but you know the stories. They make the sky feel less vast. Back inside, the fire burns lower. You settle onto your straw mattress. Again. It shifts beneath you. Something small skitters in the corner, probably a mouse. You're too tired to care. Your stomach is full enough, not satisfied, not comfortable, just quiet for now. That's the key. Hunger never truly leaves you. Adite waits. You close your eyes, muscles still aching from the field. Tomorrow will demand the same labor, the same energy, the same uncertain hope that the crops will grow tall and golden. As sleep creeps in, you think about bread, about thick slices, soft and warm, about meat dripping with juices. It's almost funny how often you dream about food. You turn slightly, straw rustling beneath you. Outside, the wind moves softly across the fields you ploughed earlier, and somewhere deep inside your ribs, beneath the steady rhythm of survival, hunger curls up, again resting but never gone. You wake in the middle of the night because something is crawling across your ankle. You don't scream. You don't even flinch much. You just sigh. Welcome home. The hut is darker now, the fire nearly dead, only faint embers glowing like tired eyes in the corner. The roof above you, thick bundles of straw tied tightly together, rustles softly when the wind passes over it. That same thatch that keeps the rain out also makes a surprisingly comfortable hiding place for insects, small birds, and occasionally worse. There's an old belief, repeated often, that the phrase "it's raining cats and dogs" comes from animals falling out of thatched roofs during heavy storms. It's a charming story. Scholars still argue whether that's true or just one of those historical myths we enjoy repeating. Either way, you're pretty sure nothing has fallen on you yet tonight, so you count that as a win. You brush your ankle. Fleas, most likely, or lice, or something equally committed to sharing your body heat. You sit up slowly. The straw mattress crackles beneath you. Straw bedding is cheap and replaceable, but it's not exactly hygienic. Over time, it absorbs sweat, moisture, and whatever else life brings into a single-room home. Replacing it requires time and fresh straw, neither always abundant. You glance around your home. It's small enough that you can see everything from where you sit. The floor is packed dirt, not charming rustic flooring, actual earth, flattened and hardened by years of footsteps. When it rains heavily, dampness seeps upward, making the floor slightly muddy. There are no carpets, no polished wood planks. A simple wooden table stands near the wall. Rough, functional. A few clay pots rest on shelves. One cracked bowl has been repaired carefully with twine. Nothing is thrown away if it can be fixed. Mainstream fact: most medieval peasant homes were one-room structures built from wattle and daub, a woven wooden frame coated in a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung. It dries into a surprisingly sturdy wall, but it's not exactly insulation paradise. In winter, cold creeps in. In summer, heat lingers. You stand up and add a small piece of wood to the fire, coaxing it back to life. Wood is valuable. You don't waste it. Forest rights are controlled. You might be allowed to gather fallen branches, but cutting trees without permission, that could mean fines or worse. The smoke thickens briefly, swirling around your head before finding its lazy way out through a small hole in the roof. Chimneys are rare luxuries here. Most smoke just escapes eventually. Or it doesn't. Your eyes water slightly. You cough once, quietly, so you don't wake anyone else. You glance toward the corner where the animals are penned, if you have them. A chicken shifts, maybe a goat. Keeping animals inside protects them from theft and predators, and their body heat adds a few precious degrees to the room in winter. It also adds smell. The scent of smoke, damp earth, animal musk, and stale straw blends into something uniquely medieval. It's not overwhelming to you anymore. It's just home. You step outside for a breath of fresh air. The night is cool and silent, except for distant wind moving across the fields. The stars are sharp again, glittering in the dark sky. Without modern light pollution, the heavens feel almost intimidating. So wide, so endless. You lean against the hut wall. This is the part no one romanticizes in storybooks. Not the golden harvest scenes, not the cheerful market days, just you, barefoot in cool dirt at midnight, scratching flea bites and listening to livestock breathe. There's an odd little detail historians note about medieval homes. Sometimes, people hung bunches of herbs like rosemary or thyme from the rafters, partly for cooking, partly to mask unpleasant smells, and partly because some believed certain herbs warded off evil spirits. Scholars still argue whether the evil spirit concern was genuine fear or symbolic language for disease. Either way, you wouldn't mind hanging a few extra herbs yourself. You step back inside before the chill seeps too deep into your bones. Your spouse shifts slightly, but doesn't wake. The child murmurs softly in sleep. You settle back onto your straw mattress, adjusting until the least pokey section rests under your ribs. The hut creaks gently. Wood expands and contracts with temperature changes. That sound is familiar now, almost comforting. Still, there's always a quiet vulnerability in these walls. They're not thick stone. They won't stop determined thieves. They certainly won't stop fire. Fire is the greatest fear. One stray spark, one overturned candle, one careless moment, and the entire village could go up in flames. Thatched roofs burn fast. Close-set huts mean flames jump quickly from one to another. You've seen the aftermath once before, a blackened patch where homes once stood. Rebuilding takes months, sometimes years. You close your eyes again. Your body is tired enough to fall back asleep, even if the mattress protests. Tomorrow, smoke will rise again. The dirt floor will still be cold beneath your feet. The animals will shift and cluck and bleat. The roof will rustle. The fleas will persist. This is not luxury. It's not even comfort, really. It's survival, shaped into routine. Morning will come soon enough, announced again by that complaining church bell. You'll rise, step into mud, walk to the fields, eat thin porridge, repeat. But right now, in this fragile quiet, you lie still and let the hut hold you. Smoke drifts upward, the embers glow softly, and the medieval night presses gently against your thin earthen walls. Morning comes with a cough, not the gentle, polite kind. The deep, rattling one from the neighbouring hut, the kind that sounds like someone trying to dislodge their lungs. You recognise it instantly. Old Thomas. He's been coughing like that for weeks. You lie still for a moment, staring up at the dark beams of your roof, listening. The cough continues, then fades into a wheeze. No one rushes over. There's no clinic to visit, no pharmacy to consult. Illness here is endured quietly, or it isn't endured at all. You push yourself upright, joints protesting again. Your throat feels scratchy too. Smoke does that. Living in a one-room hut with a constantly burning fire means you inhale soot daily. It keeps you warm, cooks your food, and slowly irritates your lungs. A charming trade-off. Mainstream fact, medieval peasants had limited access to medical care. While monasteries sometimes offered basic treatment and herbal remedies, most villages relied on folk healers, midwives, or simple home remedies. Germ theory doesn't exist yet. No one knows about bacteria. They talk about bad air or imbalanced humours instead. You step outside and immediately notice the smell. Not just the usual manure and damp earth. Something sharper. A hint of rot from the drainage ditch that runs along the village path. Waste disposal is minimal. Chamber pots are emptied outside. Animal droppings accumulate. Rain washes some of it away. Some of it lingers. Clean water is precious. The village well serves everyone. If it becomes contaminated, sickness spreads quickly. You've seen it happen before. 1 week of stomach pain and fever rippling through hut after hut. Scholars still argue whether medieval hygiene was as poor as older stereotypes suggest, or if some communities practiced more cleanliness than we assume. There are records of public bathhouses in certain towns, especially earlier in the Middle Ages, but here, in your small rural village, bathing is infrequent. Water must be carried, heated, conserved. You splash a little cold well water on your face and hands. It's bracing, but it doesn't remove much beyond surface dirt. Old Thomas coughs again. You glance toward his hut. His wife stands in the doorway, worry carved into her face. She catches your eye and gives a small, tight nod. It's the kind of nod that says, "We're managing." It also says, "We're afraid." Illness doesn't just threaten the sick person, it threatens the entire household. If Thomas can't work, the family's food supply shrinks. If he dies, his wife may struggle to maintain their strips of land. Widowhood is not just grief, it's economic danger. You head toward the fields again, the air damp and cool. As you walk, you notice a rash on your forearm. Red, itchy, probably from insects. Or maybe something else. You try not to think about something else. There are illnesses you understand, colds, fevers, broken bones from farm accidents. And then there are the terrifying ones, sudden swellings, strange spots, high fevers that take someone in days. You've heard stories from travelling merchants about a great sickness that once swept through entire regions, emptying villages almost overnight. The Black Death. It's not here now, but the memory lingers in collective whispers. Entire families gone. Fields left untended. There's an odd little detail historians often note. Some people during plague outbreaks carried small pomanders, little bowls filled with fragrant herbs. believing sweet smells protected them from disease. The idea of miasma, or bad air causing illness, shapes much of medical thinking. Whether it truly helped, probably not. But fear always seeks something tangible to hold. You bend to your work, but your mind drifts. What if Thomas doesn't recover? What if next winter brings more than frost? You shake the thoughts away. There's no space for them right now. The soil doesn't wait for existential dread. Mid-morning, you slice your finger on the edge of a tool. It's not deep, but it bleeds steadily. You wrap it in a scrap of cloth. There's no antiseptic, no clean bandage, just pressure and hope. Infection is the quiet killer. A simple cut can swell, redden, and fester. You've seen fingers lost, sometimes entire hands. And if infection spreads, well, you don't like finishing that sentence in your mind. By midday, the sun is warmer, sweat mixes with dirt on your skin, flies gather quickly, persistent and bold. You swat them away, but they return, as if personally offended. You remember how children often survive one illness only to succumb to another. Infant mortality is heartbreakingly common. Many families lose at least one child, sometimes more. It becomes a grim rhythm: birth, hope, sickness, loss. Scholars still argue how medieval parents coped emotionally with such high child mortality. Did frequent loss create emotional distance, as some older historians suggested? Or did parents love just as fiercely, grieving just as deeply despite the risks? If you have a child of your own, you know the answer in your chest. You love fiercely, even knowing the odds. The bell rings faintly from the village. You straighten slowly, back, aching again. Across the field, someone sneezes violently. Another coughs. Life expectancy numbers float in modern textbooks. 30 years, maybe 40 if you're lucky. But those numbers hide the daily resilience required to reach even that far. You glance at your hands, calloused, cracked, slightly swollen at the knuckles. They look older than you feel inside. Inside, you still imagine a long future. Inside, you assume you'll see many more harvests, even though history suggests otherwise. As you walk back toward the village in late afternoon, you pass Thomas's hut again. The coughing has quieted. That could be good, or it could be worse. You don't ask. Sometimes not knowing is easier than hearing the answer. Back in your own hut, you wash your cut finger again in cool water. It stings. You mutter a short prayer, not dramatic, just habitual. Health here is fragile. Bodies are tools, and tools wear down. You settle onto your stool, staring at the small fire beginning to glow again. Smoke curls upward, familiar and irritating all at once. Outside, the village continues in its steady rhythm. Inside, you sit quietly, aware of how thin the line is between alive and gone, and you realize something unsettling. It's not just the labor that makes this life hard, it's the constant, quiet awareness that your body, your only real possession, can fail you at any moment. You wake up already doing math. Not the fancy kind with quills and parchment. The peasant kind, the kind that lives in your head like an unpaid tenant, always present, always demanding attention. How much grain is left? How much can you spare? How much will they take? Because today isn't just another day of sweating in the fields. Today is a day for counting, for obligations, for those little invisible hands that reach into your harvest before you even taste it. You step outside and the village air feels heavier than usual, not with fog, but with tension. People move a little faster, speak a little less, eyes flick toward the path that leads to the manor. Tax day, or rent day, or tithe day. In your world, those categories blur together into one big sensation. Somebody is coming to collect. Mainstream fact: medieval peasants often owed multiple forms of payment. Labor, services, working the Lord's land, rent in kind, a portion of crops, and various fees like milling grain at the Lord's mill. On top of that, the church required a tithe, commonly described as a tenth of produce, though the exact practice varied by time and place. Variations are nice in theory. In practice, you never feel like the variation works in your favor. You wash your face at the well and see your reflection again, wavy and distorted. You look like someone who doesn't get to keep what they grow, which, yes, accurate. Back in your hut, you pull out what you've set aside, a sack of grain, a few eggs if the hens are laying, maybe a bit of wool. Not much. Never much. But enough to avoid trouble. Trouble is expensive, trouble is public, trouble is humiliating. You step out with your offering and you're not alone. Other villagers walk the same direction, each carrying what they can. It looks almost like a sad little parade. Quiet people with bundles, baskets, sacks. You follow the dirt path toward the manor's storage barns. The manor itself sits slightly elevated because of course it does. Even the landscape reminds you who's in charge. The steward is there again. He's always there, like a persistent rash on the social order. He stands with a wax tablet or parchment and a stylus, ready to record. Behind him, a couple of strong men watch the line. Not soldiers exactly, but close enough to make the message clear. Pay or else. You step forward when it's your turn. The steward looks at your sack of grain, then at you, then back at the sack like he's judging a disappointing pie. He weighs it, estimates, scribbles. You keep your face neutral. He doesn't ask how the harvest went. He doesn't care. If your children are thin, he cares about numbers, about the manor's storage, about satisfying his lord. Scholars still argue whether lords extracted as much as possible with ruthless efficiency, or whether there were more negotiated, flexible relationships between lords and villagers in some regions. Maybe some lords were kinder. Maybe some peasants had more bargaining power. But standing here, watching your grain disappear into someone else's pile, it's hard to feel like you're part of a negotiated relationship. It feels like taking, and you being taken from. After the Lord's due comes the church's due. The priest doesn't look like the steward, but the result is similar. You hand something over. The tithe might be collected in produce, grain, eggs, lambs, sometimes even honey. If you can't pay, you owe later, and owing later is like walking around with a rope loosely tied to your ankle. The church gives you something back, supposedly: spiritual security, a place to pray, a community rhythm, charity in hard times, sometimes. But the tithe still stings because you're handing over food you could eat. There's an odd little detail people forget. Churches often stored significant amounts of grain and goods, and in some communities that storage could help during famine. In others it became another symbol of wealth concentrated away from the hungry. Which version you live under depends on your priest, your region, your luck. Luck again, always luck. When you're done at the manor, you're not done. There are fees. Fees for using the mill because grinding grain by hand is brutal and slow, and the Lord's mill is efficient, so you must use it. And pay fees for using the Lord's oven if the manor controls communal baking, fees for grazing animals on common land, fees for collecting firewood. It's like the world is built out of little toll gates. You start to wonder if you'd have to pay a fee just to breathe near the manor wall. A neighbour leans close and mutters, "They'll tax the air next." You almost smile. Humour in hardship is one of the few things no one can officially collect from you. Though don't worry, they'll try. You walk home lighter, but not in the good way. Lighter in the way that comes from giving away what you worked for. At midday, you eat a smaller meal than usual because you're rationing again. You stare at your bread and think of your grain sitting in the Lord's barn. The sun is bright, the fields are green, everything looks abundant, and yet this is the trick of medieval life. Abundance exists, but not equally. You head back to the fields anyway because the work doesn't pause for tax collection. Crops still need tending. Weeds still need pulling. The season still marches forward. Your hands work automatically, but your mind keeps circling the same thought. What's left for you? You're not lazy. You're not trying to avoid responsibility. You're just exhausted by the idea that no matter how hard you work, a chunk of your effort belongs to someone else by default. That's the psychological weight of it. Not just physical labor, but the constant reminder that your survival is conditional. Conditional on paying. Conditional on obeying. Conditional on staying in your place. In late afternoon, you hear the bell again and you stop, wiping sweat from your forehead. Your shirt smells like earth and salt. You walk back through the village and notice how everyone is quieter after collection days, like the village itself has been skimmed, like a pot that's been scraped too hard. You return to your hut and sit for a moment, hands resting on your knees. Outside, children laugh faintly. Life continues, it always continues, because it has to. But you feel that steady, simmering thing beneath the surface. Not rebellion, not yet, just the awareness that you work and you give and you work and you give, and the tallies keep growing, scratched into wax or inked onto parchment, while your own stores remain thin. You stare into the fire, listening to it crackle softly, and you think, very quietly, as if even the thought might be taxed. How long can this go on? You don't really fall in love, not in the way songs centuries later will describe it. You fall into arrangement. You're standing outside the church on a mild afternoon, hands awkward at your sides, while two families speak around you as if you are a sack of grain being carefully evaluated. Your future spouse stands a few steps away, eyes lowered, posture polite and stiff. You've spoken before, of course, briefly, under supervision, maybe at a market day or after Sunday Mass. You know their laugh, you know the way they carry water from the well, you know they work hard. That's what matters most. Marriage for you is not about romance. It's about survival. Mainstream fact. In medieval peasant communities, marriages were often arranged or at least heavily guided by family considerations. Land access, labor capacity, and economic stability played far bigger roles than personal passion. That doesn't mean affection never developed, but it wasn't the foundation. The priest clears his throat. You exchange vows you barely understand in full. Latin phrases float above you like incense smoke. You nod when prompted. You repeat what you're told, and just like that, you are husband and wife, or wife and husband. No dramatic music. No elaborate feast unless your village is especially fortunate. Maybe there's bread, a bit of ale, a small roasted bird if someone is generous. Then you go home. Your home, which is likely still your family's hut, or maybe a slightly rearranged space nearby. Privacy is a luxury. If you're lucky, you'll eventually build your own small dwelling from wattle and daub. But materials cost time, and time costs labor. That first night feels strange. Not frightening, not magical, just strange. You sit side by side near the fire, both aware that life has shifted. You are now a unit, a working pair, two bodies to till fields, fetch water, gather wood, repair fences, and eventually produce children, because children are not optional in this system. They are extra hands, future workers, insurance against aging. Scholars still argue whether medieval peasants felt deep emotional intimacy in marriages shaped by economic necessity. Some letters and records suggest tenderness and loyalty. Others show clear power imbalances. It probably depends on the couple, on personality, on luck. Luck again. The next morning, nothing feels romantic. You rise before dawn, as always. The bell still rings. The fields still wait. But now there's someone else beside you in the half-darkness, someone breathing quietly, Someone equally tired. Over time, routines intertwine. You learn each other's habits, who rises first, who stirs the fire better, who handles animals more calmly, who hums softly while kneading dough. There's comfort in that rhythm, but there's also pressure. Children arrive, or you hope they do. Fertility matters here in a very practical way. A childless couple faces whispers, pity, sometimes suspicion. Pregnancy is both hope and danger. Childbirth is risky, painful, unpredictable. There are midwives, experienced women who've helped deliver many babies. They carry herbs and knowledge passed down through generations. They offer calm voices in chaotic rooms, but there are no guarantees, an odd detail historians often note. During labor, some women clutched relics or tied specific charms around their waists, believing they would ease delivery. Scholars still argue whether these were deeply spiritual practices or cultural traditions, blending faith and folklore. Either way, when pain comes in waves and fear fills the room, you'll hold anything that promises safety. If you're the husband, you wait outside, pacing in dirt worn smooth by others who've done the same. You hear cries. You hear the midwife's instructions. You pray. If you're the wife, you breathe through pain that feels like it might split you open. You grip rough cloth. You focus on surviving. Sometimes you both do. Sometimes only one of you does, and that's the shadow always hovering over marriage here. Not dramatic betrayal, not scandalous affairs, but the quiet possibility that death may interrupt everything at any moment. When a child survives, though, when that small cry fills the hut, there's a kind of fragile triumph in the air. You hold that tiny body and feel something fierce awaken inside you. Love, yes, love exists here. It just grows differently. It grows between shared labor, between rationed meals, between long winters and short harvests. You sit outside one evening, months later, watching your spouse mend a torn tunic while the baby sleeps nearby. The sun sinks low, turning the sky soft gold. You realize you don't need grand romance. You need partnership. You need someone who will wake before dawn with you, someone who will split firewood when your back aches, someone who will bury grief beside you if it comes. Marriage is less about butterflies and more about endurance, but endurance builds something steady. You laugh together sometimes, over small things. A chicken escaping, a neighbor slipping in mud, the steward's perpetually annoyed expression. You share whispered frustrations about taxes, quiet dreams about a slightly larger hut someday. Dreams don't cost coin. Yet as years pass, your roles settle deeper. Work divides but overlaps. The double burden for women is especially heavy. Field labor plus household duties plus child rearing. Men carry physical strain too, but women often carry both visible and invisible work simultaneously. Scholars still argue how much autonomy peasant women truly had. Some records show women managing land, participating in markets, even appearing in local courts. Others reveal strict patriarchal controls. Your daily life likely contains both constraint and quiet competence. You glance at your spouse again as dusk deepens. This life is not soft, but it's shared, and that makes it bearable. The bell rings in the distance, calling for evening prayer. You stand together, walk back toward your hut, step inside. The fire glows, the baby stirs. Your spouse smiles faintly at you, tired but steady. No minstrels will sing about this moment. No manuscript will illustrate it in gold leaf. But here, in this smoky, cramped space beneath a roof that leaks in heavy rain, something quietly resilient exists. Marriage isn't escape, it's alliance. And in a world that takes and takes and takes, alliance might be the closest thing you have to security. Your child learns to walk on a dirt floor. There's no soft rug to cushion the fall. Just packed earth, a little uneven, cool in the mornings and slightly damp when it rains too hard. Yichua hover nearby anyway, hands half extended, ready to catch them if they tumble too sharply. They wobble, fall, cry for a moment, then try again. You smile, but it's the kind of smile edged with something else. Not just pride, worry. Because in your world, childhood is short. Very short. Mainstream fact. In many medieval communities, children began contributing to household labor by the age of 5 or 6. Tasks were small at first, fetching water, scaring birds from fields, gathering kindling, but they grew quickly with age. Childhood, as a long, protected stage of life, is largely a modern concept. Your child is barely steady on their feet, and already you're imagining the day they'll carry a small basket to the field. You don't rush it. You're not heartless. You enjoy these early years as much as anyone can in a smoky hut with limited food and constant work. You teach them simple words, point out birds overhead, show them how to hold a spoon. But there's always the quiet. Awareness that survival requires contribution. You step outside with them in your arms, letting them feel the morning air. The bell rings faintly again, as it always does. They blink at the sound, startled, then curious. You wonder what their life will be like. Will it be exactly like yours? Probably most peasants remain peasants. Social mobility exists in rare cases through the church, through trade, through sheer luck. But those stories are exceptions, not rules. You sit them down near the hut while you patch a broken tool handle. They play with a small wooden carving someone in the village made. Nothing elaborate, just a roughly shaped animal. It's enough. There's an odd detail historians sometimes mention. Children in medieval villages often played games involving imitation of adult roles. Mock farming, mock trading, mock cooking. Play doubled as training. Scholars still argue whether medieval parents viewed children as miniature adults or recognized a distinct phase of childhood with its own emotional texture. Watching your child laugh at nothing, you suspect the truth is somewhere in between. They are small, they are vulnerable, they are absolutely not miniature adults, but the world will not treat them gently for long. You remember the first child you lost. If you've lived long enough, there's likely been one. A fever that came too quickly. A cough that worsened overnight. A tiny body too still in your arms by morning. Infant mortality is heartbreakingly common. Many families lose at least one child before the age of 5. It doesn't make it easier. It doesn't dull the grief. It just makes it more frequent. Scholars still argue whether high child mortality created emotional detachment in parents. But standing here, holding your living child a little tighter than necessary, you know detachment isn't protection. Love arrives immediately, regardless of risk. Your child toddles toward the chickens and squeals when one flaps unexpectedly. You laugh, then quickly glance around, as if joy might draw unwanted attention. By age 5 or 6, they'll start helping, carrying small bundles of sticks, chasing birds from grain, running messages between huts. By 10, they'll handle tools. By 12 or 13, they'll be considered nearly grown. There's no teenage rebellion phase here, no leisurely years to figure things out. You figure things out while doing. Education, if it exists at all, is minimal. The priest might teach a few prayers, maybe letters, if he's patient, and you're fortunate. But literacy among peasants is rare. Knowledge is practical. How to plant, how to mend, how to store grain, how to avoid angering the steward. You watch your child fall again, scrape their knee lightly on the dirt. They cry louder this time. You scoop them up, brush the dust away, murmur soft reassurances. There are no antiseptic wipes, no colourful bandages, just spit on cloth and hope. You glance toward the fields, knowing you'll have to leave soon. Work doesn't pause for parenting. Often children come along. You've seen toddlers tied gently to mothers' backs while they weed rows, seen older siblings supervising younger ones in the shade of a tree. It's not neglect, it's necessity. At midday, you bring your child to the edge of the field while you work. They sit with other children playing in dirt that looks suspiciously similar to the dirt you're cultivating. They laugh, you sweat, you glance at them often, measuring their strength, their health. Is that cough just dust? Is that rash just heat? Your mind tracks tiny changes constantly. There's a quiet calculation in parenting here. How much food can you spare for them? How much for yourself? When stores run low, adults often eat less, so children can have more. It's not heroic. It's instinct. You imagine your child one day, standing where you stand now, gripping a plow, staring at the horizon. Will they resent you? Probably not, because they'll understand. This isn't a life chosen from many options, it's inherited. You walk home at dusk with your child's small hand wrapped around one of your fingers. Their grip is surprisingly strong. You glance down at them, dirt-smudged and bright-eyed, and feel that familiar mixture of hope and fear twist together in your chest. You can't give them luxury. You can't give them safety guaranteed. You can only give them skills, resilience, and love. You step back into your hut as the fire flickers softly again. Your child curls up on straw near you, already sleepy. Outside, the wind moves across fields that will one day belong to them or trap them, just as they do you. You lie back, listening to their breathing even out in the dark, and you realize something quietly heavy. In this world, raising children isn't about shaping dreams, it's about preparing them for endurance. Winter doesn't arrive dramatically, it creeps. One morning, you step outside and the air bites a little sharper than usual. The mud under your feet feels stiffer. The breath leaving your mouth lingers longer in front of your face. You pause for a moment, staring at it, as if the cold itself has become visible. You know what that means. Winter is coming, and winter is never casual here. By late autumn, you're already in preparation mode. Firewood stacked carefully against the hut wall. Grain stored in sacks tied tightly against rats and dampness. Salted meat, if you were fortunate enough to slaughter an animal, hung or packed away. Every bundle matters. Every handful of grain feels like insurance against hunger. Mainstream fact, medieval peasants often slaughtered livestock in late autumn because feeding animals through winter required precious stored grain. Meat was then salted, smoked, or dried to preserve it. Fresh meat in deep winter was rare unless you were wealthy. You run your hand along the stacked firewood and mentally calculate whether it's enough. It never feels like enough. The first frost arrives quietly, silvering the fields at dawn. You walk through it and hear the faint crunch beneath your steps. It's beautiful in a distant way, white crystals catching morning light. It's also terrifying. Frost can damage late crops. A sudden deep freeze can ruin what little remains in the ground. You glance at the sky as if negotiating with it. By midwinter, the village feels smaller. People stay inside more. Smoke rises constantly from huts, creating a thin grey haze that clings to everything. The sun appears late and leaves early, like it has better places to be. Inside your hut, the fire becomes the center of life. You sit close to it, turning slightly to warm one side, then the other. Your hands hover over the flames, careful not to waste fuel but desperate for heat. The thatched roof groans softly under occasional snow. If it accumulates too heavily, someone must climb carefully and clear it. A collapsed roof in winter is not an inconvenience, it's a disaster. There's an odd detail historians sometimes mention. Some medieval households slept in shared beds not just for space, but for warmth. Body heat is valuable. Scholars still argue how common that practice was across different regions, but here, in your hut, closeness is practical. You wrap yourself in wool that smells faintly of smoke and sheep. It scratches your skin, but you're grateful for it. The fields are quiet now, no ploughing, no planting, just waiting. Winter is a season of endurance. You wake later than usual because there's less daylight to chase, but sleep doesn't feel restful. The cold seeps through walls, through straw, through bone. Your breath fogs inside the hut. Water in a bucket sometimes freezes overnight. You break the thin layer of ice with your hand, wincing at the sting. Hunger sharpens during winter. You're stored. Grain dwindles week by week. Meals grow thinner, more water in the pottage. Less substance. You notice how quickly tempers flare this time of year. Small arguments feel larger when everyone is confined to one room. Cabin fever isn't a modern invention. It just doesn't have a catchy name yet. You step outside to gather more firewood, fallen branches only because cutting trees without permission invites fines. The forest looks skeletal now, branches bare, ground hard. You pull your cloak tighter and listen. Winter silence is different, heavier. The usual birds are quieter. The wind sounds louder against empty trees. In deep winter, sickness spreads easily. People cluster indoors, smoke irritates lungs. Nutrition dips. Old Thomas, if he survived autumn, coughs again. The sound feels more fragile now. Scholars still argue how much winter mortality affected overall village populations compared to epidemics and famine. But you don't need statistical models to know that winter claims its share. You carry wood, back carefully, fingers numb. Inside, your child huddles near the fire. Their cheeks are red from cold. You add another log, watching flames leap higher for a moment before settling into a steady burn. You glance at your grain sack, lighter, always lighter. You calculate again. If you ration strictly, maybe it lasts until early spring. Maybe late winter is the hardest stretch, the hungry gap, some call it centuries later, the time when stored food runs low and new crops haven't yet grown. It's the narrow bridge between endurance and desperation. You lie awake one night listening to the wind howl harder than usual. Snow taps softly against the walls. You imagine the fields beneath it, sleeping. You hope they wake in spring, because if they don't, you turn your thoughts away from that path. There's a small moment one evening when snow falls gently instead of violently. Large flakes drift down, slow and quiet. You step outside and let one land on your hand. It melts instantly. It's beautiful. You stand there longer than necessary, watching white gather across rooftops and fields. For a brief second, the village looks almost peaceful, clean, silent. You forget the hunger, the taxes, the aching cold, just for a second. Then the wind shifts, biting at your face, and you retreat inside. Winter doesn't care about beauty, it cares about endurance. You sit by the fire again, rubbing your hands together, listening to your family breathe in the dim light. The days are short, the nights are long, and you count each one carefully, like coins in a nearly empty purse, waiting for the first fragile signs of spring. Spring does not explode into your life. It seeps in slowly, like warmth returning to stiff fingers. One morning, you step outside and the air feels different. Not soft yet, not generous, but no longer cruel. The frost has retreated into memory. The mud returns, thick, enthusiastic, unavoidable mud, but this time it carries promise. Winter loosened its grip. You survived. That alone feels like an accomplishment. And with spring comes something else. Noise. Real noise. Birds argue in the trees. Children shout more freely. Tools clatter as they're dragged back into fields. The village exhales, long and tired, and then inhales deeply again, and then, almost unexpectedly, a feast day arrives. Not a grand royal event, not some glittering court celebration, just a holy day on the church calendar. But for you, that's enough. Mainstream fact? Medieval peasants observed numerous feast days tied to the church calendar: Easter, Christmas, saints' days, harvest festivals. These days often meant reduced labor, communal meals, music, and sometimes games. Despite the hard life, the liturgical year structured time with regular celebrations. You wash your face more thoroughly than usual. You brush dust from your tunic. You even smooth your hair with damp fingers. The church bell rings louder today, almost cheerful. People gather outside the small stone building, murmuring softly. There's colour in the crowd. Faded reds, dull, blues, a hint of green, dyed wool brought out for special occasions. Inside, the priest speaks in Latin again. You don't understand every word, but you recognize the rhythm. You bow when others bow. Cross yourself when they do. The incense curls upward, mixing with candle smoke. There's comfort in ritual. Outside the church, something rare happens. Tables appear. Simple wooden boards set across barrels. Women bring bread. Someone brings a small roasted pig. Ale is poured, thin and not particularly strong, but plentiful enough to warm your chest. You take a piece of meat, actual meat. It's not tender by modern standards. It's a little tough, slightly salty, possibly overcooked. It is the best thing you've tasted in weeks. Your child grins, grease on their chin. For a few hours the weight lifts. There are games, wrestling matches between young men, foot races, maybe a mock swordplay using sticks. Children chase each other in circles. Someone plays a simple pipe or drum. The music is repetitive, but lively. You laugh, and the laugh feels unfamiliar in your mouth, like a muscle you don't use often enough. There's an odd little detail historians sometimes note. On certain feast days, peasants engaged in misrule traditions, temporary role reversals, playful mockery of authority, harmless pranks directed at figures of power. Scholars still argue how widespread or politically meaningful these traditions were. But even small jokes at the steward's expense feel rebellious in a gentle, almost safe way. You see the steward standing near the edge of the gathering. He's not laughing. He never laughs. You don't mock him directly. You're not foolish. But someone nearby imitates his stern walk, exaggerated and stiff, and the group around you stifles laughter. The steward pretends not to notice. Even power relaxes slightly on feast days. As afternoon stretches on, the ale loosens tongues. Stories flow. Tales of old harvests, distant cities someone once visited. Rumors of wars in lands you've never seen. For a brief moment, the world feels larger than your strip of field. You sit on the grass, leaning back on your hands, sun warm, against your face. This is the paradox. Your life is hard, but it's not entirely joyless. Scholars still argue whether feast days function primarily as social control, brief emotional release preventing unrest, or genuine communal expressions of faith and solidarity. Sitting here, belly fuller than usual, listening to music, you don't analyze it. You just feel grateful. Grateful for sunlight, for laughter, for the rare sensation of abundance. As dusk approaches, candles are lit again. Someone begins a slower song. Couples sway gently, not elaborate dancing, just simple stepping in rhythm. You glance at your spouse. They smile faintly at you. The lines around their eyes look softer tonight. For a few hours, you are not calculating grain, not worrying about frost, not counting taxes. You are simply present. Eventually, though, the fire burns lower. The ale runs out. The priest reminds everyone of morning obligations. The fields wait. They always wait. You walk back to your hut, under a sky fading from orange to deep blue. The village is quieter now, but not heavy. Your child yawns, tired from running. You step inside and sit for a moment in the dim glow of embers. You realize something quietly important. Joy doesn't erase hardship, but it punctuates it. It creates small islands in a sea of labor. And sometimes those islands are enough to keep you rowing. You lie back on your straw mattress, muscles still tired, but spirit lighter than usual. Tomorrow the plough returns. The steward watches. The grain grows or fails, But tonight you carry the echo of music in your ears, and for once, as sleep drifts in, the world feels slightly less heavy. The laughter from the feast fades quickly. By the next morning, the village returns to its usual posture, heads slightly bowed, movements efficient, eyes alert, because joy is temporary, authority is not. You're halfway to the fields when you hear shouting. Not playful shouting, not children arguing, sharp voices, angry. You turn and see a small crowd gathering near the center of the village. Curiosity pulls you closer, even though you know curiosity can be dangerous. In the middle stands a young man from a neighboring hut. You recognize him. Strong, quiet, usually first in the fields. His hands are bound loosely in front of him. The steward stands nearby, jaw tight. The accusation spreads through whispers. He was caught taking extra wood from the forest. Not fallen branches. Cut wood. Without permission, it sounds small, it feels enormous. Mainstream fact, medieval forests were often controlled by lords, and peasants had limited use rights. Collecting deadwood, grazing animals, gathering berries. Cutting live timber without authorization could result in fines, corporal punishment, or other penalties depending on the region and time period. The steward speaks loudly enough for everyone to hear. Rules exist for a reason. Order must be maintained. The young man stares at the ground. You wonder if he needed the wood for warmth, if his stores were low, if winter lingered too long in his hut. Scholars still argue how strictly local laws were enforced in everyday rural life. Some regions show evidence of flexible, community-based justice. Others reflect harsher feudal control. But here, in this moment, the message is clear. Do not step outside your place. The punishment isn't brutal today. A fine, extra labor days, ode to the manor, public reprimand. But the humiliation does the real work. You feel it ripple through the crowd. Fear, subtle and effective. You step back slightly. Law here isn't distant. It isn't abstract. It stands in front of you with boots in the mud. There's no police force as you know it, no formal courtroom with elaborate procedures. Justice is local, often administered by the lord's officials or village courts composed of elders. You've seen other punishments before. Stocks placed near the church, where someone accused of theft or drunkenness sits with hands and head locked through wooden boards while neighbors walk past. Sometimes people throw rotten vegetables. Sometimes they just stare. Public shame is currency. There's an odd detail historians often mention. Certain minor crimes were punished symbolically, like forcing someone who committed slander to carry a heavy stone around the village as a sign of the weight of their words. Scholars still argue how widespread these symbolic punishments were, but the creativity of humiliation seems timeless. The crowd disperses slowly after the steward finishes speaking. You walk to the fields quieter than usual. Your mind keeps returning to the bound hands. You think about all the small rules you follow every day without thinking. Where you can graze animals, which path you must take, when you can marry, how much grain you must surrender. Freedom exists technically, but it's narrow. You bend to pull weeds, the motion automatic now. The sun rises higher. Sweat gathers at your temples, and yet even here, law follows you. You remember a time when two neighbors argued over a strip of land boundary. No fences marked it, just memory and custom. The dispute lasted weeks, finally settled by village elders, who listened, nodded gravely, and declared a decision neither man loved. You learned something that day. Justice here isn't about perfect fairness. It's about preserving order. Order keeps the harvest moving. Order keeps taxes flowing. Order keeps rebellion distant. Scholars still argue whether medieval peasants perceived their legal systems as oppressive or simply normal. After all, you don't compare your life to something you've never seen. You measure fairness by local expectations, not by distant ideals. Still, there's a tension in your chest today, but because if he can be punished for cutting wood, what small mistake might catch you next? You slice carefully with your tool, hyper-aware of every action. By midday, the sun burns hotter. The morning drama fades into background memory, but not entirely. The young man works at the far edge of the field now, eyes lowered, movements stiff. You wonder if he regrets it, or if he'd do it again to keep his family warm. That's the cruel calculus of it all. Law demands obedience, winter demands fuel. Sometimes they clash. As afternoon drifts on, you glance toward the manor in the distance. Its walls seem sturdier today, more permanent. Authority always looks solid from afar. Back in the village that evening, life resumes its steady rhythm. Someone repairs a broken cartwheel. Children chase each other. The priest walks slowly between huts, murmuring evening prayers. You sit by your fire, staring into the flames. The wood crackles softly. You think about rules, about lines you cannot cross, about how your life is structured not just by seasons and hunger, but by boundaries invisible and very real. You don't hate the system, not in loud, rebellious terms. You just feel its weight, like a hand resting constantly on your shoulder, not squeezing, just reminding. Stay where you are. You lie down on your straw mattress and listen to the wind brushing lightly against the thatch. Outside, the village sleeps under watchful stars. Inside, you close your eyes with the quiet understanding that tomorrow will demand the same obedience, and you will give it. Because in this world, survival often means knowing exactly how far you're allowed to step, and never 1 inch beyond. You don't see the army at first. You hear it, a distant vibration under your feet while you're in the field, hoe in hand, pulling stubborn weeds from between barley shoots. At first, you assume it's thunder. The sky is clear, though, no dark clouds gathering. Then the sound sharpens, metal clinking, hooves striking packed earth. Voices, not village voices. You straighten slowly, hand shading your eyes. On the far road beyond the fields, a line of figures moves like a ripple across the horizon. Sunlight glints off something bright. Helmets, spear tips, bits of armor. Your stomach drops. War has nothing to do with you and everything to do with you. Mainstream fact. Medieval wars were often fought between rival lords or kings, but peasants bore much of the indirect burden. Armies marched across farmland, requisitioned food, trampled crops, and sometimes forced villagers into service. Rural populations frequently suffered more than the nobles who initiated conflicts. The line of soldiers grows clearer. They're not attacking your village, at least not yet. They're moving through, that's what you tell yourself. Moving through, which still means something. You glance at the other villagers. Word spreads quickly, without words. Tools drop. People hurry toward huts. Doors close. Chickens scatter. You run back toward your home, mud splashing against your legs. Inside, your spouse looks up, eyes wide. They heard it too. You gather what you can quickly. Not everything, there's no time. Just essentials. A sack of grain, a few blankets. You've heard stories of villages burned simply because they stood between two feuding lords. Scholars still argue how common outright village destruction was compared to more routine plundering. Some regions experienced repeated devastation, others were spared by luck or strategic insignificance. You have no idea which category your home belongs to. You step back outside. The soldiers are closer now. You can see their faces, young, tense, some barely older than boys. They're not monsters. They're hungry, tired, ordered to march. That doesn't make them harmless. The first few pass without incident. They glance at huts, at livestock. One gestures toward a goat. Another shrugs. Then an officer, better dressed, mounted, raises his hand. The column slows. Your heart pounds. Requisition. That word travels through the air like a chill. They need supplies. Food, grain, maybe animals. You step forward reluctantly. When motioned to, the officer speaks briskly. You catch fragments. King's service, temporary, loyalty. Temporary rarely feels temporary. You open your sack. Again. More grain handed over. Your winter calculations shatter in your head. They move from hut to hut, collecting what they deem necessary. A chicken here, a sack of barley there, a wheel of cheese from someone who thought it hidden. One soldier kicks over a small fence accidentally, or maybe not accidentally. You flinch, you watch your child standing behind your spouse, eyes wide, silent. You want to shield them from this, but you can't shield them from the world. There's an odd detail historians sometimes mention. Some medieval armies carried protection, letters promising villages safety in exchange for cooperation. Scholars still argue how effective these documents truly were, especially when hungry soldiers operated far from direct oversight. Paper promises burn as easily as huts. The soldiers finish collecting. They don't burn anything today. You exhale, slowly as they march onward, leaving churned mud and lighter storerooms behind. The field, once orderly rows of green, now bears hoofprints slicing across it. Barley bent, wheat crushed. You walk slowly to the edge and kneel, trying to lift a flattened
stalk.
It won't stand straight again. War doesn't need to strike you directly to wound you. It steps on what feeds you. By late afternoon, the village gathers in small clusters, whispering, counting losses, recalculating rations. Anger flickers, but quietly. No one shouts at the retreating column. That would be foolish. Scholars still argue whether peasant communities felt loyalty toward distant kings during medieval conflicts, or whether allegiance was primarily local. For you, loyalty feels abstract. Survival feels immediate. You return to your hut and sit heavily on the stool. Your spouse speaks softly, trying to estimate what remains. You listen, nodding, mind racing. If spring harvest is good, maybe you recover. If not, you push that thought aside. Night falls uneasily. The usual sounds of the village feel muted. Even dogs bark less. You lie on your straw mattress, staring at the thatched ceiling. You imagine the soldiers camping somewhere beyond the ridge, fires lit. Meat roasting, your meat, perhaps. You feel something new tonight, not just weariness, not just obedience, but vulnerability. Because no matter how carefully you plant, how diligently you pay taxes, how faithfully you attend church, armies can still appear on the horizon, and there is nothing you can do to stop them. You close your eyes, listening to distant wind that almost sounds like marching. Tomorrow you'll return to the fields and assess the damage properly. You'll straighten what can be straightened, replant what can be replanted. Because that's what peasants do. War may belong to kings, but its footprints press deepest into your soil. The sickness doesn't arrive with banners, no warning bells, no distant vibration in the soil. It begins with a rumor. A merchant passing through mentions a village 2 days away, where people are dying quickly, fever, swelling, dark spots on the skin. He speaks casually at first, like it's just another piece of road gossip. You feel your spine tighten anyway. You've heard stories like this before. Stories of a great plague that once swept across entire regions, emptying homes and leaving fields untended. Grandparents whisper about it in low voices, as if saying its name too loudly might invite it back. Mainstream fact: the Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century, killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population in some regions. Caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, it spread rapidly through fleas carried by rats and through human contact. Of course, you don't know any of that. All you know is that people are coughing. By the end of the week, old Thomas, who survived winter, takes to his bed again. This time the cough sounds different. Wet. Desperate. His wife doesn't stand in the doorway today. She stays inside. The priest visits. You see him enter the hut, cross in hand. He emerges later, face pale. You don't need confirmation. The village grows quieter. Doors stay shut. Children are called indoors earlier. You walk to the well with tension in your shoulders, as if the air itself has become suspicious. Scholars still argue how medieval communities understood plague transmission. Most believed disease spread through miasma, or bad air, or divine punishment. Without microscopes or germ theory, explanations leaned heavily on faith and fear. You notice something unsettling. The rats seem bold lately. One darts across the path in front of you, vanishing beneath a pile of wood. You shudder, though you don't. Know why? Inside your hut, you examine your child more closely than usual. Any warmth in their forehead makes your heart race. Any cough, however small, feels ominous. The first death comes quickly. Thomas. No long decline, no gradual fading, just fever one day, silence the next. The bell tolls differently for death. Slower, heavier, each ring presses into your chest. You attend the burial because that's what the village does. Community doesn't dissolve in fear, not immediately. The grave is shallow compared to your comfort. Soil thrown hurriedly. The priest speaks quickly. He has more huts to visit. Within days, 2 more fall ill. A child, a woman, barely older than you. The symptoms are whispered now. Swellings in the groin or armpit, blackened skin in places, pain so intense that screams echo through thin hut walls. You wake at night listening for coughing, listening for silence. There's an odd detail historians often note. During plague outbreaks, some communities organized processions of self-flagellants, people who whipped themselves publicly in hopes of appeasing divine anger. Scholars still argue how widespread these movements were and whether they helped or worsened transmission. You haven't seen flagellants here, but you have seen people praying harder than ever before. You pray too, even if you're not entirely sure who you're trying to convince. The fields begin to suffer again, not from frost or war this time, but from absence, fewer hands, unplowed strips, weeds creeping confidently into neglected rows. You stand in your field alone one morning, noticing how quiet it feels. No distant chatter, no familiar laugh from across the furrows. The steward rides through less often now. Even authority looks nervous. Scholars still argue whether the plague ultimately improved conditions for surviving peasants by reducing population and increasing labor demand. Some records show wages rising, obligations loosening in certain regions. But standing here now, surrounded by fresh graves, long-term economic shifts feel abstract. What you see are empty huts. What you hear are bells. Your spouse coughs one evening. It's small. Probably dust. You freeze anyway. The next morning, they wake with a fever. Your world narrows instantly to the space inside your hut. You press a damp cloth to their forehead. You whisper reassurances you don't fully believe. The priest visits again, face more exhausted than before. Your child sits quietly in the corner, unusually silent. Time becomes strange. Hours stretch. Night blends into day. You watch for swellings, for dark spots, for anything you've heard described. Scholars still argue about the psychological toll of plague on medieval communities, the mix of terror, fatalism, and unexpected resilience. You don't feel philosophical, you feel afraid. Your spouse's fever breaks on the 3rd day. Slowly, gently, they open their eyes and breathe more evenly. You collapse onto your stool in relief, so intense it almost feels like grief. Not everyone is so fortunate. By the time the sickness passes, because eventually it does, the village looks altered. Fewer faces, wider gaps between huts, fields partially reclaimed by weeds. You walk through the village center and feel the absence like wind moving through an open door. Survival feels heavy now. Not triumphant, just heavy. You stand near Thomas's hut, now silent and half abandoned. You imagine him laughing at the last feast. You imagine the young man punished for woodcutting standing beside him in the fields. Life was fragile before. Now you understand exactly how fragile. You return home, step inside, and sit near the fire. Your child curls against your side. Your spouse rests quietly. The bell rings once more, not for death this time, but for prayer. You bow your head, not because you understand what happened, not because you feel enlightened, but because in a world where sickness can sweep through like unseen wind, survival feels less like achievement and more like accident. After the sickness passes, something lingers. Not the fever, not the swelling, but the question. Why? You step outside one morning and the village feels thinner. Sound travels farther now, there are fewer bodies to absorb it. The wind moves easily, between huts where doors no longer open. You glance toward the church almost automatically. Faith feels heavier these days. Mainstream fact. In medieval Europe, religion shaped nearly every aspect of daily life. The church structured the calendar, governed moral codes, and offered explanations for natural disasters, disease, and war. Most peasants attended Mass regularly and believed deeply in divine order. You believed too. You still do. But belief now carries an edge. The priest speaks about divine testing, about sin, about mercy. He insists the plague was either punishment or mysterious will. Scholars still argue how peasants interpreted catastrophe, whether they internalized guilt or saw events as part of a larger cosmic plan beyond human control. Standing there among empty spaces where neighbors once stood, you don't feel particularly sinful. You feel small after the service. Whispers begin again. Someone says the sickness came because of a comet seen months ago. Someone else claims a traveling merchant brought it deliberately. Another mutters that a family down the lane angered God by missing a feast day. Superstition moves quickly when logic fails. There's an odd detail historians often note. Medieval villages sometimes blamed marginalized groups, outsiders, minorities, strangers, for outbreaks. Scholars still argue how widespread these scapegoating patterns were in rural versus urban settings. You haven't seen violence erupt here, but suspicion hums quietly in conversations. You catch yourself scanning faces differently now. Not with hatred, with fear. Fear makes everyone look slightly dangerous. You kneel in your field later that day, pressing seeds into soil for the next cycle. The earth doesn't care about theology. It doesn't answer questions, it simply receives what you give it. You whisper a small prayer, anyway, not elaborate, just a plea for stability. Inside your hut, you hang a small wooden cross above the door. It's simple, carved by a neighbor before he died. You trace its edges with your finger. Protection feels symbolic, but symbols matter. Your spouse places a sprig of rosemary near the hearth, not just for cooking, for luck, for cleansing, for warding off unseen harm. You don't argue, you add a prayer to it. Faith and folklore blend easily here. No sharp line separates them. Scholars still argue how much medieval spirituality combined official church doctrine with local traditions and older pagan remnants. For you, categories don't matter. If lighting a candle and hanging herbs brings comfort, that's enough. The nights feel longer again, not because of winter, but because your mind refuses to settle quickly. You lie awake, listening to ordinary sounds, the creak of beams, the distant bark of a dog, and wonder if they conceal something larger. You imagine angels and demons hovering invisibly above fields. You imagine punishment, falling like frost. You imagine protection, forming like an invisible wall around your hut. Imagination fills the gaps where knowledge cannot. One evening, a wandering friar passes through the village. He speaks passionately in the square about repentance, about the end times, about signs in the sky. Some villagers nod fervently, Others look weary. You stand at the edge of the gathering, unsure whether to feel inspired or unsettled. The friar insists that suffering purifies. You glance at the fresh graves again in your memory. Purifies whom? You don't say it aloud. Doubt here is quiet, if it exists at all. Mainstream fact. After the Black Death, some regions experienced both increased religious fervor and subtle questioning of church authority. While the institutional church remained powerful, cracks in unquestioned belief began appearing in certain communities. You don't see cracks, you see tension, you still attend Mass. You still kneel. But now, when the priest speaks of divine plan, you feel both comfort and confusion simultaneously. The sun sets one evening in brilliant streaks of red and gold. You stand outside, watching it sink beyond the fields. The world looks beautiful, too beautiful for so much death. You hear your child laugh behind you, chasing a chicken again, and you turn quickly, grateful for the sound. Life continues stubbornly. That feels almost rebellious. You step inside and sit near the fire, watching sparks drift upward. You think about fate, about randomness, about whether your survival had anything to do with virtue or luck. Scholars still argue whether medieval peasants viewed life as entirely predetermined by divine will or believed in some degree of personal agency. You feel both. You plant seeds, but you can't command rain. You pray, but you can't halt plague. You work, but armies still march. Faith doesn't erase fear, it just gives it structure. You lie down on your straw mattress, staring up at the roof. Beams. You whisper a final prayer into the dim light. Not for wealth, not for glory, just for ordinary days, ordinary bells, ordinary hunger. Because after what you've seen, ordinary feels miraculous. And in this smoky hut, beneath thatched straw and uncertain skies, that quiet longing for nothing more than stability feels like the most human prayer of all. You wake before the bell again, not because of noise, because of habit, and because there's too much to do. You sit up slowly, rubbing sleep from your eyes, and for a brief second, just a second, you allow yourself to imagine doing nothing today. Then you laugh softly. Nothing is not an option. You step outside and feel the early morning damp settle against your skin. The fields wait. The well waits. The animals wait. But before any of that, the fire must be stirred. Water must be carried. Porridge must be boiled. If you are a woman in this village, your day begins even earlier and ends even later than most. Mainstream fact. Peasant women in medieval Europe typically worked in the fields alongside men while also managing household duties, cooking, cleaning, spinning wool, mending clothes, child-rearing, tending small livestock. Their labor was constant and often unrecorded in official documents. You stir the embers, coaxing flame from grey ash. The smoke rises, curling into your face. You cough lightly but keep working. Your spouse steps outside to prepare tools, but you remain inside a little longer. You sweep the dirt floor with a rough broom made of twigs. You check the grain sack. You set aside a small handful for grinding. The child wakes and begins asking questions immediately. You answer while kneading dough. Multitasking isn't a skill. Here, it's survival. You head to the fields once breakfast is eaten, thin again, because stores are still recovering after war and sickness. You bend beside your spouse, pulling weeds, scattering seed. From a distance, your labor looks identical. Up close, it isn't, because your mind is split in two, half in the soil, half at home. Is the water bucket full enough? Did you leave the chicken? Pens secure? Is the child playing too close to the ditch? Scholars still argue how much autonomy peasant women truly exercised within households. Some records show women appearing in manorial courts, managing property when widowed, even running small market stalls. Others reveal strict patriarchal authority limiting choices. Your life contains both constraint and competence. You may not own the land, you may not speak in every council, but you know exactly how much grain remains. You know when the bread will mold. You know how to spin wool thin enough to stretch through winter. There's an odd detail historians often note. Spinning was so constant that the distaff, the tool used to hold wool, became a symbol of womanhood. Scholars still debate whether this symbolism reflected respect for female productivity or simply reinforced gender roles. You spin at night sometimes, fingers working automatically, while listening to conversation drift through the hut. The wool twists between your fingers, thread forming steadily. Thread becomes cloth. Cloth becomes clothing. Clothing becomes warmth. Warmth becomes survival. Invisible work creates visible life. By midday, your back aches. You straighten briefly, pressing your hand to the small of it. Your spouse notices and says nothing. There's no extra laborer waiting to take your place. You bend again. Later, you return to the hut and begin preparing the evening meal. The fire must be tended carefully. Fuel is limited. Too much wood wastes supply. Too little leaves food half-cooked. The child tugs at your sleeve, wanting attention. You give it while stirring the pot. You teach them small things while working. How to measure grain by feel, how to notice when milk turns sour, how to avoid stepping on embers. Lessons woven into chores. If you are pregnant, your labor does not pause. You work slower. You rest slightly more. But fields do not wait 9 months. Birth approaches quietly in the background of daily tasks. You carry water. You weed rows. You mend clothes. You prepare for life and death simultaneously. Scholars still argue how much communal support women received during childbirth in rural villages. Midwives were central figures, but outcomes remained uncertain. Every pregnancy carried risk. You feel that risk like a shadow behind you, and yet you continue, because this system does not allow retreat. Evenings are not restful. After the meal, there is washing to do, clothes beaten against stone near the stream, wool to spin, tools to repair. Your spouse may rest slightly sooner, muscles spent from ploughing, but you remain upright a little longer, finishing what cannot wait. You do not resent them, you simply endure. There's a quiet strength in that endurance, but it is heavy. You step outside briefly after dark, letting cool air touch your face. The stars are sharp tonight. You tilt your head upward. You think about how small your world is and how much of it you hold together with invisible threads. No one records your name in official ledgers unless you owe something. No one paints you in bright manuscript margins, but the hut stands because you tend it. The child grows because you feed them. The household functions because you balance it. You step back inside, close the door gently, and sit near the fading fire. Your hands are cracked, your shoulders sore, your eyelids heavy. Tomorrow will be the same, and the next day, and the next. You lie down on straw that still rustles beneath you. You listen to breathing beside you, and you realize something quietly sobering. This life doesn't just demand labor. It demands everything: your time, your body, your strength, your silence. And yet, in that relentless demand, you continue because stopping isn't part of the story. Enduring is. You notice it one morning while lifting a sack of grain. It's heavier than it used to be, or maybe you're weaker. You pause halfway through the motion, breath catching in your chest, a sharp reminder that your body is not what it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago you moved without calculation. Now every bend, every twist carries a quiet warning. You're not old, not by number, maybe 35, maybe 40. But in your world that feels ancient. Mainstream fact. While average life expectancy in medieval Europe was often cited around 30-35 years, this number is heavily influenced by high infant mortality. Adults who survive childhood could live into their 50s or beyond, but hard labor, disease, and poor nutrition made aging visible earlier than in modern times. You straighten slowly, pressing a hand into your lower back. It aches constantly now. Your knees complain when you kneel in the field. Your hands are permanently calloused, knuckles swollen, and slightly crooked. Small scars map your skin, cuts from tools, burns from embers, scrapes from fences. Each mark is a memory of work. You glance at your reflection in the well's surface. The face staring back has lines around the eyes. Your hair carries threads of grey you don't remember inviting. Scholars still argue how medieval people perceived aging. Without modern retirement concepts, there was no clear elderly phase. Many worked until they physically could not. Respect often depended less on age and more on usefulness. Usefulness, that word lingers. You walk to the fields with slower steps than before. Younger villagers move more quickly now, their bodies unburdened by decades of repetition. You remember being that quick. You remember mocking the way older farmers stretched before bending. Now you stretch too, quietly. There's an odd detail historians sometimes mention. Some medieval texts describe people believing that aging accelerated after certain illnesses or periods of famine. Scholars still debate whether this perception reflected real physiological decline or symbolic association between hardship and visible aging. You suspect it's both. The plague years etched something into everyone's faces. War did too. You bend to weed, but your back protests after only minutes. You straighten more often now, pretending to survey the field, though really you're buying your spine a few seconds of mercy. You begin to think about succession. Who will handle your strips when you cannot? If you have children, they are nearly grown now, their shoulders broader, their hands stronger. You feel pride watching them lift what you once lifted. You also feel a flicker of displacement. The field doesn't need you as much as it once did. Your spouse notices your slower pace. They don't comment. Instead, they quietly take on a slightly larger share of the heavier tasks. Partnership shifts gradually like that. You return home at dusk and sit longer before standing again. Rising from the stool takes more effort. Your knees crack audibly. There is no healer to consult about joint pain, no balm promising relief beyond simple herbal salves. Some villagers rub aching limbs with warmed oils or crushed herbs. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. You try anyway, because even small comfort matters. Scholars still argue whether medieval peasants expected long lives or simply focused on surviving year to year. You realize you've rarely thought far ahead. The next harvest, the next winter, the next tax collection. Now, for the first time, you imagine yourself not in the field. What happens then if you cannot work? Your value shifts. You might help with lighter tasks, mending tools, watching children, sharing stories of past harvests. You might advise younger farmers about frost patterns or soil changes, or you might simply fade. You see it in the oldest villager, bent nearly double, hands trembling slightly, once strong, now slow. He still walks to the field some mornings, not to work heavily, but to stand and observe. He's not useless, but he's no longer central. That thought unsettles you. You've defined yourself by labor for so long that imagining life beyond it feels hollow. You step outside one evening, stretching stiff muscles under a sky streaked with orange. The air smells like earth and wood smoke, familiar, grounding. You watch your child, no longer small, swing a hoe with efficient rhythm. You feel both proud and unnecessary. There's something quietly cruel about peasant aging. You don't retire, you wear down. You don't step into leisure, you step into limitation. Scholars still argue how medieval communities cared for elderly members. Some lived within extended family households, supported by adult children. Others relied on charity from church or neighbors. Formal systems were rare. You hope your family will support you, but hope feels fragile. You sit back inside near the fire, letting warmth seep into your aching joints. You trace your fingers over an old scar on your forearm and try to remember when you got it. You can't. The years blend together into seasons. Plow, plant, harvest, winter, repeat. You lie down carefully on your straw mattress, adjusting to ease pressure on your back. Sleep comes more slowly now, your body doesn't relax easily. You listen to the steady breathing of your household and realize something quietly humbling. Your life has been measured in effort, and aging doesn't grant you rest. It simply reminds you that effort has limits. Tomorrow you will rise again. You will stretch longer. Work slower. Endure. Because even as your body softens at the edges, the land remains firm beneath your feet, and it still expects you to show up. It starts as a whisper, not loud enough to echo across fields, not bold enough to reach the manor walls, just a murmur passed between bent backs and tired hands. They're asking too much. You hear it first while repairing a fence post with two other villagers. The wood is split, your fingers numb from gripping the hammer too long. One of them leans closer than usual, voice barely above breath. The Lord in the next county reduced labor days after the sickness, he says. Too many died. He needed workers to stay. You keep your eyes on the nail. You don't react, but your pulse quickens. Mainstream fact. After major population declines, especially following the Black Death, labor shortages in parts of Europe led to shifts in the feudal system. In some regions, peasants demanded lower obligations or wages for work. This tension sometimes sparked uprisings, such as the English peasants' revolt of 1381 revolt. It's a dangerous word. You don't say it aloud, but the idea lingers. The sickness left empty huts, the war trampled crops, the steward still collects dues as if nothing changed, and now, with fewer hands, every obligation feels heavier. You notice it more clearly this year. The labor days on the Lord's domain haven't lessened, even though the number of workers has. The fields demand more, the manor demands more. You bend beside younger villagers who mutter under their breath about fairness. Fairness. Another fragile concept here. Scholars still argue whether peasant revolts were spontaneous eruptions of anger or carefully organized responses to systemic pressures. From where you stand, it doesn't feel like strategy. It feels like exhaustion turning into something sharper. One evening, several villagers gather quietly near the edge of the forest, not openly, not dramatically, just a few trusted faces. You attend because curiosity pulls again, and because something inside you is tired of simply accepting. The discussion is cautious. No one shouts, no one makes grand declarations. They talk about reducing labor days, about negotiating with the steward, about presenting a united front. United. That word feels powerful and dangerous. There's an odd detail historians sometimes note. During certain uprisings, peasants destroyed manorial records, parchments listing dues and obligations. Scholars still debate whether this was symbolic rebellion or a practical attempt to erase legal constraints. You imagine parchment burning, names and numbers curling into smoke. The thought both thrills and terrifies you, because rebellion doesn't happen in stories here. It happens in mud, and it can end badly. You remember hearing about revolts in distant regions, peasants marching toward towns, confronting officials, demanding change. Some succeeded briefly. Many were crushed harshly. The steward rides through the village the next morning, expression unreadable. Does he sense it? Does he feel the shift in posture? You glance at other villagers. They move normally, work normally. But something subtle has changed. A quiet tension. You work the fields and think about negotiation. Is it rebellion to ask for fairness or survival? Scholars still argue whether peasants saw themselves as challenging the entire feudal system or simply seeking practical adjustments within it. For you, it's not about overthrowing kings. It's about having enough grain left to feed your family. That's not treason, that's necessity. Days pass. The murmurs grow slightly bolder. Someone suggests refusing an extra Labor Day demanded unexpectedly by the steward. Silence follows. Refusal carries risk, fines, punishment, public humiliation, or worse. You lie awake that night staring at the thatched ceiling. You've obeyed your whole life, paid dues, worked fields, prayed, endured. And yet, survival still feels conditional. You think about your aging body, about your child stepping into labor too soon, about war taking grain, about plague taking neighbors, and you feel something new. Not anger, exactly. Resolve, soft, tentative, but present. Next week, when the steward announces an additional labor requirement for repairing a distant manor fence, the village does something small. They hesitate, not dramatically, not with raised fists. Just hesitation. No one steps forward immediately. The pause stretches. The steward's eyes narrow slightly. Scholars still argue whether revolts often began with such small collective acts of resistance, delayed compliance, subtle defiance, before escalating. You stand there, heart pounding, waiting to see who moves first. Finally, one older villager speaks calmly. "We cannot spare the time," he says. "The harvest suffers." It's not a threat, it's a statement. The steward stiffens. The moment hangs in the air like a held breath. Then, surprisingly, he nods once. The extra labor is postponed. Not cancelled, but postponed. A small victory, almost invisible, but real. You return to the fields feeling different. The land looks the same. The mud still clings to your boots, but you feel less alone inside your skin. Because unity, even fragile unity, changes the texture of survival. Rebellion doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it simply pauses, and in that pause, you realize something quietly radical. You are not just labor, you are community. And even in a world built on hierarchy and obligation, community has weight. After the tension of whispers and small defiance, something unexpected arrives. Color. Not in the fields, they remain their steady green and brown, but along the road leading into the village. You hear it before you see it. The creak of wagons, the jingle of harness bells, the murmur of unfamiliar voices. Not soldiers this time, not tax collectors, merchants, a traveling market. You straighten from your work almost involuntarily. Markets don't come every week, sometimes only a few times a year. But when they do, they stretch your world wider than the horizon. Mainstream fact. Medieval rural villages often relied on periodic markets and fairs for goods they could not produce themselves: salt, iron tools, cloth, pottery, and occasionally imported luxuries like spices. Some larger fairs became major trade centers linking distant regions. You wipe your hands on your tunic and walk toward the road with the rest of the village. There's a quiet excitement in the air, muted because coin is scarce, but real. The wagons roll in slowly, wheels groaning over uneven ground. Colourful cloth drapes from one cart. Another carries clay pots stacked carefully. A third smells faintly of spices, sharp and foreign. You inhale deeply. It smells like another world. There's an odd detail historians sometimes mention. Medieval fairs weren't just about trade. They were also hubs for news, entertainment, and storytelling. Scholars still argue how much exposure rural peasants had to distant events through such gatherings, but even small markets could carry rumours from cities days or weeks away. You drift, closer to a stall displaying iron tools. The blacksmith in your village is skilled, but iron from travelling merchants sometimes carries different designs, lighter, sharper, better balanced. You pick up a small knife. It feels smooth in your hand. You check your pouch instinctively. There are only a few coins, or perhaps you barter, grain, wool, eggs. You calculate quickly in your head. Is this knife worth thinner meals later? That's the equation for everything here. Nearby, your child stares wide-eyed at bright-dyed cloth, reds and blues deeper than anything woven in your village. They reach out cautiously, fingers brushing fabric as if it might vanish. You watch their expression and feel that familiar mixture of pride and ache. You want to give them the cloth, you probably won't. A storyteller stands on an overturned crate, speaking loudly about a distant city where buildings rise higher than trees and streets are paved with stone. He exaggerates clearly, but exaggeration feels intoxicating. You've never seen a city, you've heard of them. Scholars still argue how much medieval peasants desired urban life versus feared it. Cities offered opportunity, but also disease, crowding, and unfamiliar risks. From where you stand, it simply sounds different. Different is powerful. You wander past a spice cellar and catch the scent of cinnamon. Sweet. Warm. Almost magical. You've tasted something like it only once before, during a feast day when a wealthy visitor brought treats. The merchant explains it traveled from lands far beyond your understanding. You imagine caravans crossing deserts, ships cutting through endless water, markets larger than your entire village. Your world expands in your mind, even if your feet remain in mud. There's music too. A small group with a fiddle and drum. Not polished, but lively. Children gather. Adults pretend not to listen too closely. For a few hours, your village feels connected to something larger. Not isolated, not trapped. Connected. You barter for a small bag of salt, essential, worth the cost. Without salt, food spoils faster. Salt is not luxury, it's survival. The merchant wraps it carefully. Your pouch feels lighter again, always lighter. But your mind feels heavier, in a good way. Full of images, full of possibility. As afternoon drifts, toward evening, the wagons begin packing up. The colors fold away, the spices seal back into sacks. The storyteller moves on. The road swallows them slowly, and the village returns to its usual tones, earth and smoke. Scholars still argue whether these periodic markets planted seeds of social change by exposing rural communities to new ideas and goods. Standing there watching the last wagon disappear, you understand something subtle. The world is larger than your strip of field. You can't go there, but it exists. And knowing that changes something quietly inside you. You walk back toward your hut, carrying salt and a slightly sharper knife. Your child walks beside you, still talking about the bright cloth. You smile faintly. You'll never own that cloth, but you've seen it. You've smelled cinnamon. You've heard stories of stone streets. That counts for something. Inside your hut, the fire glows as it always does. The walls are still wattle and daub. The roof still thatch. The floor still dirt. Nothing physical has changed, and yet, a tiny crack has opened in the boundaries of your imagination. You sit down and turn the new knife in your hand, watching firelight glint off its edge. The fields will call again tomorrow. Taxes will return. Winter will come again. But now, when you look toward the horizon, you don't just see limits, you see roads. And for a peasant whose life is measured in furrows and seasons, that glimpse of distance feels almost like freedom. The road lingers in your mind long after the wagons disappear beyond the bend. You return to the fields the next morning, but something inside you keeps glancing sideways toward that thin strip of earth that leads away from everything you've ever known. You press your boot into the soil, feeling its familiar give beneath your weight. The land is steady, predictable, demanding. The road is none of those things. Mainstream fact, while many medieval peasants were legally tied to the land, especially serfs, some had limited mobility. In certain regions, a peasant who escaped to a town and lived there for a year and a day without being reclaimed could gain freedom. Scholars still debate how common or practical such escapes truly were. A year and a day. You roll that phrase around. In your head, as you lift your hoe, could you do it? Leave everything behind, walk until your legs tremble, disappear into a city of stone and noise. The idea feels both thrilling and absurd. You glance at your spouse working a few rows over, at your child carrying a small bundle of sticks, at the hut visible in the distance. Leaving wouldn't just mean freedom, it would mean abandonment. Your strips of land would revert to the Lord. Your family would struggle. Community binds as tightly as obligation. Scholars still argue whether peasants, primarily identified with their local village over broader political or economic systems. For you, loyalty is personal. You know these faces. You buried some of them. Freedom isn't just a door, it's a cost. You pause and straighten your back, letting your eyes trace the horizon again. The sky stretches wide and blue, indifferent to your internal debate. There's an odd detail historians sometimes mention. Medieval peasants occasionally joined pilgrimages, not solely for religious reasons, but also as sanctioned travel. Scholars still debate how many used pilgrimage as a temporary escape from daily life versus pure spiritual devotion. Pilgrimage, that would be acceptable. Holy. You imagine walking toward a distant shrine, blending into a stream of travelers, seeing towns beyond your region, sleeping under open skies without ploughing at dawn. But even pilgrimage requires resources, time, permission. You return to your work. The soil doesn't care about your fantasies. It requires attention. Yet the seed has been planted, not in the field, in you, that awareness that life could be different if you dared to pay the price. Later that afternoon, you pass by the edge of the forest and notice a narrow footpath leading away from the main road, smaller, quieter. You step onto it briefly, just a few paces. The sounds of the village soften behind you. Your heart beats a little faster. For a moment, you imagine continuing, walking until dusk, sleeping beneath trees, becoming no one in particular. Then you hear your child calling your name faintly in the distance. Reality pulls gently but firmly. You step back onto the familiar dirt path toward home. Dreams are light. Responsibility is heavy. Scholars still argue how much medieval peasants dreamed of social mobility versus accepting their station as divinely ordained. You suspect both thoughts coexist. You don't hate your life every moment. There is beauty here. Sunrises over fields, feast days, the warmth of family, but there's also confinement, invisible walls built from custom and contract. That evening, you sit outside your hut watching the sun dip low. The road glows briefly in the fading light. You imagine travelers on it, merchants, friars, soldiers, pilgrims. You wonder what they think when they pass villages like yours. Do they see opportunity? Or just another patch of smoke rising from that? Your child sits beside you, tracing shapes in the dirt. Where does the road go? They ask. You pause. Far, you answer. It's both true and insufficient. Scholars still argue whether medieval rural life was primarily characterized by isolation or interconnection. You feel both simultaneously. You are tied, and yet roads exist. The wind shifts gently, carrying faint scents of distant places, wood smoke, earth, something you can't quite name. You close your eyes and picture yourself walking again, not as an escape, but as possibility. You open them and look at your family. Possibility has weight, so does love. You rise slowly, joints stiff but steady. You step back inside the hut, ducking beneath the low doorway. The fire glows softly. The walls remain unchanged, but inside you, something subtle has shifted. You know now that your world is larger than your field. Even if you never leave it, and sometimes knowing that is enough to keep the horizon from feeling like a wall. Another dawn, another bell. You wake before it rings this time, as if your body and the sound have finally become the same thing. For a moment, you lie still on your straw mattress, listening to the quiet hum of early morning. Your spouse breathes softly beside you. Your child, no longer so small, shifts in their sleep. The hut smells of smoke and earth and wool. It's the same smell it has always been. You sit up slowly, joints stiff but obedient. The roof beams above you are familiar. The tiny cracks in the wattle and daub walls are familiar. Even the faint draft that slips under the door is familiar. This is your world. You step outside. The sky is pale blue, barely awake. Mist clings to the fields in thin layers, as if the land itself is reluctant to rise. You look at those fields, your strips scattered among many, and feel something layered and complicated. You've ploughed them through frost and heat. You've watched armies trample them. You've seen plague leave them half-tended. You've argued quietly for fairer labour days upon them. You've dreamed of roads beyond them. And here they still stand. Mainstream fact. By the late medieval period, gradual shifts in labour dynamics and economic practices began loosening some aspects of strict feudal structures in parts of Europe. Scholars still debate how evenly or quickly those changes spread. In many villages, life remained largely cyclical and familiar for generations. Cyclical, that's the word. The bell rings at last, echoing across the damp morning air. It doesn't sound cruel anymore, just inevitable. You walk toward the fields with steady steps. Not hurried, not hesitant, just practiced. Your child walks beside you, now carrying a proper tool, not a toy. Their shoulders have broadened. Their hands carry the same early calluses yours once did. You glance at them and feel pride laced with worry. You once thought your life was entirely burden. Now you see something else. Continuity. You bend to the soil again, pressing your fingers into earth, cool from night air. It yields slightly under your touch. The land doesn't remember war, it doesn't remember plague, it doesn't record taxes, it simply grows or fails. You begin your work, the rhythm returns immediately. Pull, lift, press, step. Your body may ache more than it once did, but the motion remains familiar. There's comfort in familiarity, there's also confinement. Both can exist at once. Scholars still argue whether medieval peasants saw their lives primarily as suffering or as normalcy shaped by shared expectation. Standing here now, you understand that suffering and normalcy are not opposites, they are neighbours. You pause briefly, looking up at the horizon where the road once tempted you. You haven't left. You may never leave, but the idea remains like a quiet ember inside you. And perhaps that's enough. There's an odd detail historians sometimes mention. Some medieval villages mark time not by calendar dates, but by events. The year of the Great Frost, the summer the Lord's Son married, the season after the plague. Scholars still debate how individuals perceived long-term change versus immediate survival. You think about how you would describe your own years. The winter, we nearly starved. The spring, the soldiers came. The year Thomas died. The day we refused. Extra labor, moments stitched together by endurance. By midday, sweat beads along your brow. The sun rises higher. The day warms, nothing dramatic happens, no revolt, no army, no merchant wagons, just work. And perhaps that's the most honest ending this life offers. Not triumph, not catastrophe, just repetition. You walk home at dusk once more, the sky streaked gold and violet. Smoke rises from huts, children's laughter drifts lightly across the path. A dog barks in lazy greeting. You step inside your hut and sit by the fire. Your hands are rough, your body worn, your mind quieter than it once was. You look around this small, smoky room and understand something deeply grounded. It sucked to be a Medieval peasant because everything demanded something from you. Your labor, your grain, your obedience, your faith, your strength, but you gave it anyway, day after day, season after season, not because it was glorious, not because it was easy, but because survival required it. The fire crackles softly. Outside, the bell rings once more for evening prayer. You bow your head, not dramatically, just habitually. Tomorrow will look much like today, and in that steady repetition, there is a strange kind of endurance that outlasts kings, wars, and plagues. You lie back on straw that still rustles beneath you. You close your eyes, the mud, the smoke, the hunger, the fear, the fleeting joy, all of it settles into memory. Another dawn will come, and you will rise to meet it. Now let's slowly ease out of the fields. You can imagine the bell growing softer in the distance, the smoke thinning into cool night air. The weight of the plough slipping gently from your hands. Picture the mist settling again over quiet medieval fields, silver and calm beneath a wide, star-filled sky. The huts are still. The animals sleep. Even the steward rests somewhere beyond sight. Your body doesn't ache here. Your hands are no longer cracked. The cold doesn't bite. You simply stand at the edge of the field, watching stars shimmer overhead. Clear, endless, peaceful. The road lies in the distance, faint but visible. You don't need to walk it. You just need to know it's there. The bell rings once, soft, distant, and fades into silence. Let the smoke drift away. Let the mud dry into still earth. Let the fields rest, and let yourself rest too. You survived the medieval village tonight. You endured the hunger, the taxes, the wars, the winters, and now there's nothing left to carry. Just the quiet hum of night air and the slow rhythm of your own breathing.